December 8, 1980, 11:47 p.m. The Dakota Building, New York City. What happened in apartment 72 that night wasn't supposed to happen. The bullets were real. The blood on the sidewalk was real. The screams of Yoko Presley echoing through the Gothic corridors of the Dakota were real. But John Lennon dying? That part was a lie the world believed for 3 agonizing hours. 5 bullets from a .38 caliber revolver, 2 to the chest, 3 to the shoulder and back. Mark David Chapman standing there with The Catcher in the Rye in his hands, waiting for the police like he just completed some cosmic homework assignment. The ambulance sirens screaming down Central Park West. The emergency room at Roosevelt Hospital, where doctors worked frantically over a body that had already given up. Flatline, 11:47 p.m. No pulse, no brain activity, no hope. For 47 seconds, John Winston Lennon was clinically dead. Then, something impossible happened. A single heartbeat on the monitor. Weak, stubborn, refusing to quit. The doctors couldn't explain it. The newspapers couldn't report it accurately. And John himself couldn't understand why he'd been pulled back from whatever darkness he'd found on the other side. All he knew was that when he woke up 3 days later in intensive care, breathing through a tube and connected to machines he couldn't pronounce, something fundamental had changed. Not just in his body, in his voice. The vocal cords damaged by the trauma, the throat scarred by the breathing tube, the confidence shattered by staring into death and somehow returning. "Mr. Lennon," the doctor had said on day 5, when John could finally whisper, "Your voice may never be the same." John had tried to laugh. What came out was a broken rasp that sounded like someone else entirely. "How different?" he managed to croak. "We don't know yet. The damage is extensive." Yoko held his hand in the antiseptic silence of the hospital room. Outside, thousands of fans maintained a vigil in Central Park, lighting candles and singing Beatles songs, believing they were mourning a dead man. Inside, John Lennon was discovering something far more terrifying than death. He was discovering what it meant to survive. Brooklyn, March 15, 1981. 3 months. 97 days since the shooting. 97 days of physical therapy, speech therapy, and the kind of nightmares that make you afraid to close your eyes. The recording studio smelled of stale cigarettes and broken dreams. Studio 54 sound, not the famous nightclub, just a rundown space on Flatbush Avenue where desperate musicians came to capture lightning in bottles they couldn't afford. John sat alone in the control room, staring at the microphone through soundproof glass that had seen better decades. The leather chair creaked under his weight. He'd lost 30 pounds since December. The doctor said trauma did that. Stole your appetite along with everything else. "You sure about this place?" Jack Douglas asked, settling into the engineer's chair beside him. Jack had produced Double Fantasy, John's comeback album that was supposed to mark his return to music after 5 years of domestic life. Instead, it had become his obituary. At least, that's what the world thought. "Nobody expects to find John Lennon in Brooklyn," John replied, his voice still carrying that unfamiliar rasp. "That's exactly why I'm here." Through the window, March snow fell on Flatbush Avenue, coating the bodega signs and fire escapes in pristine white. Inside, 2 men sat with the weight of an impossible decision. Jack leaned forward, studying John's face. The beard was gone now, too difficult to manage in the hospital. The round glasses sat slightly crooked on his nose, a souvenir from when his face hit the pavement outside the Dakota. His hands shook when he thought no one was looking. "Tell me again why we're here," Jack said carefully. John reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Sheet music, handwritten in the shaky script of someone relearning how to hold a pen. "I wrote this for Sean," John said. Before everything happened. It was supposed to be simple, a lullaby, something any father could sing to his son. He set the paper on the mixing board. The title read, "Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy," in John's uncertain handwriting. "I haven't been able to sing it to him," John continued, his voice catching slightly. "Every time I try, every time I open my mouth to hit those notes I used to hit without thinking, ... He gestured helplessly at his throat. "The doctors say my vocal cords were damaged, not just from the bullets, but from the trauma, the emergency surgery, the breathing tube. They're telling me I need to accept that my voice isn't what it was." Jack studied the sheet music. Simple chord progressions. G major, C major. Nothing that should challenge one of the greatest voices in rock history. But John's voice wasn't the voice of rock history anymore. It was the voice of a man who'd been shot 5 times and lived to tell about it. It was the voice of a father who'd almost left his 5-year-old son without a goodbye. It was the voice of someone who'd spent 47 seconds in whatever comes after life and somehow found his way back. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Jack said quietly. John's laugh was bitter, hollow, like autumn leaves scraping against concrete. 20 years of my life, Jack. 20 years building this voice, this sound. The Cavern Club in Liverpool, the Ed Sullivan Show, Abbey Road Studios. Imagine. All of it built on something that's broken now. Jack reached for the coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The studio had that eternal twilight quality of spaces where time doesn't matter, where day and night blur into something that exists only for the music. "What if broken isn't the same as ruined?" Jack suggested. John looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe what happened to you, what happened to your voice, maybe it's not something to fix. Maybe it's something to explore." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, a police siren wailed down Flatbush Avenue. Inside, John Lennon contemplated the possibility that his greatest limitation might become his greatest strength. "You want me to make an album where I can't sing properly? I want you to make an album where you sing honestly." John stared at the microphone for a long moment. Then he picked up his guitar, the same Martin D28 he'd played on Double Fantasy, the one that had somehow survived the shooting when so much else hadn't. "One more time," he whispered. "Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like that helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. From the top, again. John's voice cracked on the word again. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. For 2 weeks, John had been making the journey from Manhattan to Brooklyn, taking the subway like any other New Yorker, trying to avoid recognition. Baseball cap pulled low, sunglasses even on cloudy days. The kind of anonymous existence that had once been impossible for someone whose face was as recognizable as the Statue of Liberty. Being shot had given him an unexpected gift. People saw the trauma before they saw the celebrity. Studio 54 sound had become his sanctuary. 4 walls and soundproofing that kept the world at bay while he wrestled with something that felt bigger than music, more personal than art. It was a letter to Sean, his 5-year-old son, a letter he'd never been able to say out loud. "I can't even sing to my own boy," John confessed, his fingers trembling against the guitar strings. The D28 felt heavier than it used to, like grief had added weight to the wood and steel. "Every time I try to hit the notes, every time I reach for that power I used to have." His voice broke again, not from emotion this time, from physical limitation. The doctors had explained it in clinical terms that couldn't capture the devastating reality. Vocal cord scarring, reduced range, inconsistent tone production. What they couldn't explain was how it felt to open your mouth and have someone else's voice come out. Jack Douglas had produced some of John's greatest work, Plastic Ono Band, Imagine, Double Fantasy. He'd heard John's voice at its absolute peak, the raw power that could fill Shea Stadium, the tender intimacy that could break hearts on ballads. But what he was hearing now was something different, something raw and desperate and achingly human. "What if we don't try to fix it?" Jack suggested, adjusting the levels on the mixing board with the practiced precision of someone who'd spent 30 years capturing lightning in bottles. John looked up sharply. "What? What if we don't try to make your voice sound like it used to? What if we just let it be what it is now?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Through the studio window, Brooklyn went about its business. Kids played in Prospect Park despite the March chill. Mothers pushed strollers down sidewalks lined with brownstones that had seen a century of stories. Inside, two men contemplated artistic suicide. "You want me to release a song where I can't sing properly? I want you to release a song where you sing truthfully." John stared at the microphone for a long moment. The Neumann U-47 that had captured voices from Sinatra to Dylan. A piece of equipment worth more than most people's cars, designed to make everything sound perfect. But perfection wasn't what John needed anymore. Truth was, he picked up his guitar and played the opening chords of Beautiful Boy, G major flowing into E minor. Simple progressions that a beginning guitarist could master in an afternoon. But nothing about this was simple anymore. "Tell me about Sean," Jack said from the control room, his voice coming through the talkback with unusual gentleness. John's fingers found the chord progression automatically. Muscle memory from a lifetime of playing. "He's 5 years old," John said, his voice soft and unsteady. "Still believes in monsters under the bed. Still thinks his daddy can fix anything that's broken." His voice cracked on the word broken. "Before the shooting, I used to sing to him every night. This song, others. He'd fall asleep to my voice, and I'd sit there watching him breathe, thinking about how perfect everything was." Jack leaned forward. "What do you think about now?" "I think about how close I came to never singing to him again. How 47 seconds changed everything. How he almost grew up thinking the last thing his father ever said to him was, 'Good night,' on December 7th. John began to strum the chords more confidently. "But here's the thing, Jack. When I finally tried to sing to him again, when I came home from the hospital and attempted this song, my voice cracked on every high note, every moment of tenderness, every word that mattered." "What did Sean do?" John smiled for the first time in weeks. He looked at me with those huge eyes and said, "Daddy, your voice sounds different, but it sounds more like you." Jack felt something electric run down his spine. "More like you?" "That's what he said. More like me, not like the voice on the records. Not like the voice that sang to stadiums. Like the voice of his father, who'd been scared and hurt, and was still figuring out how to put the pieces back together." John positioned himself in front of the microphone. The late afternoon sun slanted through the studio windows, casting long shadows across the control room. "One more time," he said, his voice still cracking. "But this time, let's not try to hide anything." The song was called Beautiful Boy, Darling Boy. John had written it months before the shooting, during those golden autumn days when he was just another father in Central Park, pushing Sean on the swings and pretending to be normal. Simple chords, simple words. Nothing that should have been difficult for one of the greatest voices in rock history. But John's voice wasn't the voice of rock history anymore. It was something far more dangerous. It was honest. "Close your eyes," Jack said from the control room, his finger hovering over the record button. "Don't think about the technical stuff. Don't think about how it used to sound. Just think about Sean. John closed his eyes and let his mind wander to apartment 72 at the Dakota. Sean's bedroom, with its toys scattered across hardwood floors. The rocking chair where John had spent countless nights singing lullabies. The window that looked out over Central Park, where sometimes they could see the imagined memorial that fans had created without official permission. He began to sing, "Beautiful boy, darling boy, dreamer, you're so lovely, ... The crack came on the word lovely. Not a small crack, a complete vocal break that would have ruined any professional recording session. The kind of mistake that engineers spend careers learning to prevent. Jack's finger hovered over the stop button, but John kept singing. "Close your eyes, have no fear, the monster's gone. He's on the run and your daddy's here." Another crack, this time on daddy's. The word that meant everything. The role he'd almost lost forever on a sidewalk outside his home. And something extraordinary happened. The crack didn't diminish the power of the song. It amplified it. Because in that crack, in that moment of vocal vulnerability, everyone could hear the truth that a perfect voice could never convey. This was a man who'd almost never been able to call himself daddy again. This was a voice that had been to the edge of existence and returned changed. This was the sound of someone who'd learned that perfection was the enemy of truth. John continued through the song, his voice breaking and rebuilding itself with each line. Sometimes the breaks came at predictable moments, the high notes, the sustained tones. But sometimes they came in the middle of simple words, as if his voice was responding to emotional content that his conscious mind couldn't control. When he sang about bedtime stories, his voice held steady. When he sang about growing up, it wavered slightly. When he sang about love lasting forever, it shattered completely. Because John had learned that forever was a promise no one could guarantee. In the control room, Jack sat transfixed. In 30 years of recording, he'd never heard anything like this. Not just the technical imperfection, though that was striking enough, but the emotional honesty that the imperfection allowed. John's damaged voice was telling a story that his lyrics couldn't tell alone. It was the story of fragility, of mortality, of the father's love tested by the knowledge that protection was an illusion and safety was a gift that could be revoked without warning. When the song ended, silence filled the studio like water filling a drowning man's lungs. John opened his eyes and looked through the glass at Jack. "I ruined it again, didn't I?" Jack shook his head slowly. "John, you need to hear this." Jack rewound the tape and pressed play. John sat in stunned silence as his broken voice filled the small studio. The cracks were all there, the imperfections, the moments where his voice betrayed him completely. But something else was there too. Something that had never been present in any Beatles recording, any solo work, any polished studio production. Raw, unfiltered humanity. The kind of vulnerability that most artists spend their entire careers trying to capture and never quite achieve. "My God," John whispered, his hand moving unconsciously to his throat. "That's the most honest thing you've ever recorded," Jack said quietly. John buried his face in his hands. For the first time since the shooting, he began to cry. Not from pain, not from trauma, not from the physical agony of recovery, from relief. "I thought my career was over," he sobbed, his shoulders shaking with the weight of months of suppressed fear. "I thought everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for was gone. 20 years of music, 20 years of finding my voice, all destroyed by 5 bullets and 47 seconds of death." Jack moved from the control room into the vocal booth, something producers rarely do during sessions. He sat down beside John on the small bench where countless musicians had bared their souls. "Maybe it is over," Jack said gently. "Maybe the career you had, the voice you had, the person you were, maybe all of that died on December 8th. John looked up, tears streaming down his face. That's supposed to make me feel better? Maybe this is something different, something better, something that couldn't exist until John Lennon the rock star died and John Lennon the human being was born. Through the studio windows, Brooklyn was settling into evening. Streetlights flickered on along Flatbush Avenue. Families were sitting down to dinner in apartments where music played softly in the background. Maybe Beatles songs, maybe Solo John, maybe something else entirely. "You really think people will understand?" John asked, his voice small and uncertain. "I think people have been waiting their whole lives to hear someone this meal." John wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The gesture was so simple, so ordinary, that it seemed to ground him back in the moment. "When I was dead," he said quietly, "for those 47 seconds, I wasn't John Lennon. I wasn't a Beatle. I wasn't famous or important or any of the things I'd spent my life becoming. I was just awareness, just consciousness without identity." Jack listened without interrupting. "And when I came back, when I opened my eyes in that hospital room, I realized that all the things I thought defined me, the voice, the fame, the perfect recordings, they were just costumes. Masks I'd worn for so long, I'd forgotten there was a face underneath." John picked up his guitar again, running his fingers along the familiar curves of the instrument that had been his companion for decades. "This voice, this broken, imperfect voice, it's more me than anything I've ever recorded." Outside, the Brooklyn night pressed against the studio windows. Inside, John Lennon was discovering that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you were really meant to give the world. "Let's do it one more time," he said, his voice still cracking. "But this time, let's not apologize for anything." What happened over the next 4 hours changed music forever, but nobody knew it at the time. John recorded Beautiful Boy 17 times. Each take was different. Each crack came in a different place. But Jack and John began to realize something profound as the night wore on. The cracks weren't random. They weren't technical failures or vocal limitations. They were emotional truth, made audible. When John sang about monsters being gone, his voice broke because he was still afraid. The trauma lived in his body, in his throat, in the very mechanism that created sound. When he sang about being there for Sean, his voice cracked because he'd almost not been there at all. 47 seconds of death had taught him that presence was a privilege, not a right. When he whispered about love lasting forever, his voice shattered because he'd learned how fragile forever really was. "It's like your voice is doing what your words can't," Jack observed during a break around midnight. They'd been at it for hours, and the studio had taken on that timeless quality of spaces where important work happens. John nodded slowly, sipping tea that had long since gone cold. "The fear, the gratitude, the knowledge that I almost lost everything, it's all in the cracks." They decided to keep take 14, not because it was technically the best. By any traditional standard, it was deeply flawed, because it was the most truthfully broken. But something even more extraordinary was about to happen. Word had somehow leaked about John's secret recording sessions. Not to the press. Jack ran a tight operation. But to the community of musicians and industry people who lived in the spaces between mainstream attention and underground obscurity. By 1 a.m., a small crowd had gathered outside Studio 54 Sound. Fans who'd heard rumors through the grapevine. Musicians who'd grown up on Beatles records and couldn't believe John Lennon was alive, let alone recording in Brooklyn. Maria Santos, 19 years old and studying music therapy at Brooklyn College, had heard about the sessions from a friend who cleaned the studio. She'd been standing outside in the March cold for 2 hours, not hoping to get in, just wanting to be near something historic. Tony Benedetto, a session guitarist who'd played on countless albums nobody remembered, had been working late in the studio next door when he heard John's voice through the walls. Michael Chen, a sound engineering student who'd snuck out of his dorm to witness whatever was happening, stood pressed against the building's brick facade with his eyes closed, listening to the music that seeped through the old windows. "There are people outside," Jack told John during a break. John walked to the window and peered through the blinds. 12 people stood on the sidewalk in the freezing night, their breath visible in the streetlight. "They're not paparazzi," Jack continued. "They're just fans, musicians, people who care about music." John stared at the small crowd for a long moment. In his previous life, crowds meant security guards and limousines and the careful choreography of celebrity protection. These people just looked like they wanted to be part of something meaningful. "Let them in," John said suddenly. Jack stared at him. "What?" "If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to show the world what I really sound like now, I want witnesses." One by one, 12 strangers crowded into the tiny control room of Studio 54 Sound. None of them were supposed to be there. All of them were about to experience something they'd never forget. Maria Santos found herself standing directly behind the mixing board, close enough to touch the faders that controlled John Lennon's voice. Tony Benedetto leaned against the wall with his guitar case, still in disbelief that he was breathing the same air as one of his heroes. Michael Chen set up his portable recorder in the corner, documenting what he somehow knew would be historically significant. John sat alone in the vocal booth with his acoustic guitar, separated from the crowd by a wall of glass, but connected by something deeper than physical proximity. "This is for everyone who's ever been broken," he said into the microphone, his words carrying clearly through the studio monitors. And he sang "Beautiful Boy" one final time. The crack came on the word "beautiful." But this time, when John's voice broke, something magical happened in that cramped Brooklyn studio. Maria Santos, the music therapy student who'd been standing in the cold for hours, began to hum along during the instrumental break. Her voice was untrained, imperfect, but it blended with John's broken vocals in a way that was absolutely perfect. Then Tony Benedetto opened his guitar case and pulled out his instrument, finding the chord progression by ear and adding a gentle harmony that wrapped around John's melody like a musical embrace. Then Michael Chen began tapping out a subtle rhythm on the arm of his chair. By the final chorus, 12 strangers were making music with John Lennon, their voices and instruments weaving around his cracks and breaks, turning his vulnerability into something communal and powerful and healing. The sound was unlike anything that had ever been captured in a professional recording studio. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. It was the sound of people connecting across the artificial boundaries that usually separate performer from audience, celebrity from fan, broken from whole. When the song ended, the silence in the studio lasted for nearly a minute. Then Maria Santos began to cry. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the reverent quiet. "Thank you for showing us it's okay to be broken." John set down his guitar and looked through the glass at the crowd of people who'd somehow become part of his song. "Thank you for helping me sing it," he replied. John Lennon never released that version of "Beautiful Boy" commercially. The official version that appeared on Double Fantasy was recorded later in a proper studio, with professional musicians and state-of-the-art equipment. It was smoother, more polished, more technically perfect. But bootleg recordings of that Brooklyn session began circulating among musicians and fans almost immediately, not as curiosities, as treasures, because people recognized something in John's cracked voice that they'd never heard before in popular music. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to be human. Permission to let the cracks show. Maria Santos went on to become one of the most innovative music therapists in the country, using imperfection as a tool for healing. She never forgot the night she sang with John Lennon in a broken-down studio in Brooklyn. Tony Benedetto recorded an album of songs inspired by that session, calling it "Beautiful Cracks." It never charted, but it's considered essential listening among musicians, who understand that technique is less important than truth. Michael Chen became a successful producer, but he's never tried to recreate the sound of that night. Some things, he learned, can only happen once. The recording itself became legendary among collectors and music historians. Bootleg copies traded for thousands of dollars. Sound engineers studied it to understand how vulnerability could be captured on tape. But more importantly, it changed how people thought about perfection in music. Vocal coaches began using the recording to teach students that technical ability was just one tool in an artist's arsenal. That sometimes the most powerful performances came from showing your limitations rather than hiding them. Therapists played it for patients struggling with trauma, demonstrating that surviving something terrible didn't mean you had to pretend you were unchanged. Parents sang it to their children, cracks and all, because sometimes the most beautiful lullabies are the ones that let the love show through the imperfections. John Lennon died just 9 months after that Brooklyn recording session, shot again outside the Dakota building by a different gunman who couldn't accept that his first attempt had failed. This time, there was no miraculous recovery, no 47 seconds of death followed by an impossible return. But in those 4 hours at Studio 54 Sound, he'd discovered something that outlasted death itself. The power of broken things to create beauty. The courage to let people see your cracks. The truth that sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that admits it's powerless. And perhaps most importantly, the knowledge that we don't love each other in spite of our imperfections. We love each other because of them. Today, there's a small plaque outside the building that once housed Studio 54 Sound. The studio is long gone, replaced by a trendy coffee shop that serves expensive lattes to people who've never heard of John Lennon's broken voice. But the plaque remains, placed there by fans who understood what happened that night. It reads, "In memory of the cracks that let the light in." And every December 8th, people gather there to sing Beautiful Boy. Not the perfect version, but the broken one. The one that taught a generation of musicians that vulnerability was strength, that damage could be beautiful, that the most honest art comes from the places where we've been wounded. In a world obsessed with perfection, John Lennon's cracked voice reminds us of something we desperately need to remember. The cracks are where the light gets in. And sometimes the light that shines through our brokenness is the most beautiful thing we'll ever create. The most powerful voice isn't the one that never breaks. It's the one that breaks beautifully.